Hey everyone, thanks for tuning in. Before we get started with today's story, I'd love to know where you're all watching from. Drop a comment and let me know which city or country you're representing. Okay, let's dive in. The silence in Julian Vance's office was a manufactured thing, a multi-million-dollar product of triple-paned acoustic glass and sound-dampening composites woven into the very walls. It was the most expensive silence in the city, perched 52 stories above the ceaseless symphony of traffic and ambition. From his monolithic desk, carved from a single piece of obsidian, Julian could watch the world scurry below, a complex system of inputs and outputs he had long ago mastered. He was the architect of this sterile perfection, the CEO of Vance Cybernetics, a global titan in digital security. He had built an empire of firewalls and encryption, a fortress to protect the world's data, yet his own life felt like an empty, echoing vault. A soft chime, muted and polite, emanated from his desk interface. A communication from human resources. Julian frowned. He didn't deal with HR. He dealt with board members, sovereign wealth funds, and existential threats to the digital infrastructure of entire nations. He toggled the screen, his expression impassive. The message was from Graham, his vice president of talent acquisition, and it was laced with a kind of smug, water-cooler amusement. Subject: interesting candidate. Julian thought you might find this humorous. We had a walk-in application for a junior analyst role. Woman brought her kid to the interview, her actual kid. Sat her in the corner with a coloring book while we talked. The audacity is almost impressive. Needless to say, she won't be proceeding. Some people just don't understand the culture here. Julian's jaw tightened. The culture at Vance Cybernetics was something he had meticulously crafted. A temple of hyper-competence, merciless efficiency, and unwavering professionalism. A child in an interview was a violation of that sacred space. It was unprofessional, a distraction. He felt a flash of cold annoyance, and yet something in Graham's dismissive tone chafed at him. It was the casual cruelty of it, the sneering judgment. He was about to delete the message when another one arrived from Graham. It was a single, still frame from the lobby's security feed. Here's the kicker. The girl. Julian's eyes fell on the image. It showed a woman from behind, her shoulders tense, holding the hand of a small child. His focus, however, was entirely on the girl. She couldn't have been more than 7 or 8, with her hair in 2 neat braids. She was looking back over her shoulder directly at the security camera, her expression not one of childish shyness, but of a strange, serious curiosity. It was her face that made the air freeze in Julian's lungs. There was something in the high cheekbones, the intelligent, deep-set eyes, a subtle architecture of her features that felt impossibly, achingly familiar. It was a ghost of a face he hadn't seen in nearly a decade, a face he only ever allowed himself to see in the bruised, quiet hours of the night. A question, sharp and terrifying, pierced the expensive silence of his office. What was the meaning of this? He typed a curt, one-word reply to Graham, his fingers stiff. Name? The reply was instantaneous. Ania Washington. The obsidian desk suddenly felt like a slab of ice beneath his hands. Ania, it couldn't be. The world outside the window, the city he considered his own personal chessboard, seemed to tilt on its axis. He had built these walls, this tower, this entire life, to keep the past hermetically sealed away. But the past hadn't even bothered to knock. It had walked right into his lobby, holding the hand of a little girl with eyes he was sure he had seen before in his own reflection. For the first time in years, Julian Vance felt something other than the dull ache of absence. He felt the cold electric thrill of fear. The name echoed in the vast empty spaces of his memory. Ania Washington. The woman who had dismantled his carefully ordered world with a smile and a belief in things he couldn't quantify. the art student who saw poetry in code and felt sorry for his meticulously organized, joyless life. The only person who had ever breached his firewalls without a single line of code. And he had let her go. He had chosen the empire over the woman, convinced himself it was the only logical move. Julian's hands moved with a mechanical precision, a stark contrast to the storm gathering inside him. He bypassed Graham, accessing the HR server directly. His fingers flew across the holographic keyboard, his own security protocols melting away before his master access. Application file. Anya Washington. He opened it. The photo was 10 years older, the light in her eyes a little more guarded, the lines around them speaking of sleepless nights and quiet struggles. But it was her, unmistakably. Then he opened the attached security log, the video feed of her and the child entering and leaving the building. He watched them walk toward the elevators, Ania's posture radiating a fragile defiance. The girl, Zora, the application had named her, walked beside her, her small hand clutching her mother's. As they waited, Zora looked around the lobby, her gaze not filled with the typical childish awe at the towering marble walls and the vast, shimmering data stream sculpture that dominated the space. Instead, she seemed to be tracing the lines of the building, following the hidden conduits in the walls, as if she could see the flow of information, the digital ghost that lived inside the machine. He was haunted by the girl's face and the mother's name. He leaned back, the expensive leather of his chair, groaning in protest. He brought up an old encrypted file from his personal server, one he hadn't opened in years. It was a folder simply labeled A. Inside were a handful of pictures from a different lifetime. A younger Julian, his smile not yet a corporate tool, stood on a beach with Ania. Her head was thrown back in laughter, the sun catching the warmth in her dark skin. He zoomed in on his own face in the photo. Then he toggled back to the security footage of the little girl, Zora. He placed the images side by side on his screen, the curve of the eyebrow, the shape of the chin, the uncanny, analytical intensity in the eyes. It was a perfect, impossible fusion of him and Anaya. "No," he whispered to the silent office. It was a denial born of sheer panic. It couldn't be. She would have told him, wouldn't she? Their breakup had been a cataclysm, a clean, brutal break, or so he had thought. He had buried himself in work, building Vance Cybernetics from a startup into a behemoth, precisely to fill the crater she had left behind. He had told himself the silence that followed was mutual. He made a call. Not to HR, not to his board, but to a number that wasn't listed in any company directory. "Elias," he said, his voice tight, "I have a job for you. Utmost discretion. I'm sending you a file. I need to know everything. Where she lives, where she works, where she's been for the last 9 years. Everything." Elias, his head of security and the only man he trusted implicitly, a relic from his much rougher early days, simply replied, "Consider it done, Julian." Julian ended the call and stared at the two faces on his screen, the ghost of his past and the child who was an impossible echo. He felt the foundations of his world, the one he had built with such ruthless precision, begin to groan. He learned they lived in a modest apartment in a borough he usually only flew over in his helicopter. The PI report Elias provided was concise and clinical, yet it painted a picture of a life that was the polar opposite of his own, a life of scraping by, of resilience, of dignity in the face of hardship, a life filled with a kind of warmth his climate-controlled penthouse could never replicate. The thought was a splinter under his skin. The report sat on his desk, a thin file that felt heavier than a block of lead. Elias had been thorough. Ania Washington had moved back to the city 2 years ago after her mother passed away. She'd worked a series of low-paying tech support jobs, her credentials from a community college overlooked by employers who wanted Ivy League pedigrees. Zora Washington, age 8. School records indicated exceptional aptitude in mathematics and logic puzzles. No father listed on the birth certificate. 8 years old. They had broken up just over 8.5 years ago. The math was simple, brutal, and undeniable. Julian stared out his window, but he didn't see the sprawling metropolis below. He saw a different timeline, a parallel life that had branched off from his own, a life where he wasn't alone in this glass tower. The suspicion was a roaring fire in his gut, but he was a man who dealt in absolutes, in verifiable data. He needed proof, certainty. His plan was cold, calculated, and felt like a betrayal before he even set it in motion. Elias had given him their daily routine. Ania dropped Zora at a public school in the morning, then picked her up at 3. On Fridays, they would stop at a small park near their apartment. Julian told himself it was an audit, a data-gathering mission. He wore clothes he hadn't touched in a decade: jeans, a simple gray shirt, a baseball cap pulled low. He felt like an intruder in his own city, driving a nondescript sedan instead of his chauffeured town car. He saw them before they saw him. They were sitting on a bench sharing a small bag of pretzels. Ania was listening intently as Zora explained something, gesturing with her hands. Even from a distance, Julian could see the bond between them, a self-contained universe of two. His heart, a dormant organ he used mostly for pumping blood, gave a painful thud. This was a mistake. He should leave, retreat to his sterile fortress, and pretend he'd never seen them, but he couldn't. He was a moth drawn to a flame he thought had been extinguished years ago. He walked a path that would intersect with theirs, his mind racing, rehearsing a casual, accidental encounter. As he drew near, Zora, holding a juice box, looked up and her eyes met his. There was that flicker of recognition again, that unnerving intelligence. Startled, she stumbled, and the juice box tumbled from her grasp, landing on the pavement with a small splash. "Oh, sweetie, are you okay?" Ania asked, immediately kneeling to check her daughter's knee. This was his chance. "Here, let me help," Julian said, his voice sounding rusty and unfamiliar. He knelt down, picking up the slightly dented juice box. Ania looked up, and for a moment her face was a canvas of confusion. Then her eyes widened in shock, the color draining from her cheeks. "Julian," she breathed, as if she had seen a ghost. "Ania," he said, his voice level, despite the tremor that ran through him. "It's been a long time." The air crackled with unspoken history. Her expression hardened instantly, a shield slamming down. "What are you doing here?" she asked, her tone flat and cold. It was the voice of a woman who had learned to guard her heart with razor wire. I was in the neighborhood," he lied, the words tasting like ash, "for a meeting." Zora, silent until now, looked from her mother's guarded face to the stranger's tense one. Her gaze was unnervingly perceptive. Julian held out the juice box. His fingers brushed against Zora's as she took it. It was a fleeting, insignificant touch, but for Julian it felt like a static shock, a jolt of connection that arced across the years. He retreated after a few more stilted, awkward sentences, but he had what he came for. The plastic straw from the juice box was sealed in a specimen bag in his pocket. He drove back to the city center, the anonymous sedan feeling like a getaway car. The entire process felt sordid, a violation of their trust, but he had to know. Elias handled the submission to a private lab, no names, just code numbers. The 48 hours he waited for the results were the longest of his life. The multi-billion-dollar merger he was negotiating with a Japanese conglomerate felt trivial. The market fluctuations, the endless data streams, it was all just noise. The only signal that mattered was the one he was waiting for. The notification came via an encrypted message on his secure terminal, a single PDF file. Julian opened it. He scrolled past the genetic markers and the scientific jargon, his eyes searching for the final damning sentence. Probability of paternity, 99.99%. The words blurred. The silence of his office rushed in, vast and suffocating. His carefully constructed world didn't just fracture, it detonated. The glass tower, the empire, the fortune, it all felt like a monument to a colossal, life-altering mistake. He had a daughter, a brilliant, serious little girl with her mother's strength and his own analytical eyes. And for 8 years, he hadn't even known she existed. He sank into his chair, the weight of those lost years pressing down on him, a debt he could never possibly repay. The confirmation didn't bring peace. It brought a profound and terrifying clarity. Every success, every acquisition, every accolade he had ever received turned to dust in his mouth. He had conquered the world while remaining ignorant of the one thing that might have actually mattered. Now, the question wasn't what had happened, but what he was going to do. Summoning Ania to his office like a subordinate was out of the question. A legal letter was unthinkable. This required something he hadn't used in a very long time, humility. He drove to her neighborhood again, this time with a purpose that terrified him. He found them at the same park. He approached slowly, no pretense this time, his hands empty. Ania saw him coming, and her body went rigid. She stood up, placing herself slightly in front of Zora, a lioness protecting her cub. "Julian, I don't know what game you're playing, but we want no part of it," she said, her voice low and firm. "It's not a game, Ania," he said, stopping a respectful distance away. "I need to talk to you, to both of you." He looked at Zora, who was watching him with an unnerving stillness. "Hello, Zora. My name is Julian." Zora didn't reply, her eyes flicking to her mother for guidance. "We have nothing to talk about," Ania insisted. "I think we do," Julian said softly. He took a breath, the confession feeling like tearing out a piece of his own soul. "I know about Zora." Ania flinched as if struck. The color drained from her face, replaced by a flash of fear, then white-hot anger. "You have no right," she hissed. "You have no right to come here after all this time and—" "You're right," he interrupted, his voice raw with a sincerity he hadn't felt in years. "I have no rights. I lost them. I know that, but she's my daughter, isn't she?" Ania's composure finally broke. A tear escaped, and she wiped it away angrily. She didn't answer, but her silence was a confession. The weight of her long, lonely struggle was visible in the slump of her shoulders. Zora, witnessing her mother's distress, looked at Julian with an expression of profound and premature gravity. "Mommy," Zora said, her voice small but clear, "who is he?" Ania knelt, her back to Julian. "He's someone I knew a long time ago, sweetie," she whispered, her voice thick with unshed tears. Julian's chest ached. He had to fix this. He had the resources to fix anything. "Ania, that job you applied for, it's yours. No, a better one. Head of threat analysis. Whatever you want. I can give you both everything." She turned, her eyes blazing with a proud, wounded fire. "You think you can just buy your way back in? You think money solves this? You have no idea what we've been through, what I've done to protect her, to provide for her. We don't need your charity." "It's not charity," he pleaded. "It's a start. A bad one, I admit. I don't know how to do this, Ania." He saw a flicker of something in her eyes. Not forgiveness, but a shared memory of the man he used to be, before the ambition had consumed him. He decided on a different tactic. He looked past Ania at Zora, who was clutching a small handheld device of her own creation. It looked like a repurposed gaming console, wires spilling from the casing, a tiny screen displaying lines of scrolling text. "What's that you've got there?" Julian asked gently. Zora looked down at her device, then back at him, her shyness warring with her pride. "It's a packet sniffer," she said quietly. "I'm mapping the open Wi-Fi networks in the park. Most of them have really bad security." Julian was stunned into silence. "A packet sniffer? An 8-year-old girl had built her own packet sniffer from spare parts. The pride that surged through him was dizzying, so powerful it almost knocked him off his feet. This child was more than just his daughter. She was a reflection of a part of himself he thought he had lost. The pure, unadulterated joy of creation and discovery. He crouched down to her level, ignoring Ania's sharp intake of breath. "That's incredibly impressive, Zora." "The encryption protocol on most public networks is weak. Did you use a WPA2 cracker?" Zora's eyes lit up. For the first time, the wall of shyness crumbled. "I tried, but I wrote my own script to look for handshake vulnerabilities instead. It's faster." They talked for a few minutes, a rapid-fire exchange of technical jargon that left Ania looking on in bewildered silence. In that moment, a fragile bridge was built, not between a billionaire and a struggling single mother, but between a father and a daughter, connected by a shared language of logic and code. When he finally stood up, the tension had changed. It was still there, thick and heavy with unspoken pain, but now it was threaded with a new terrifying strand of hope. He didn't push the job offer again. Instead, he just said, "I'd like to see you both again, if you'll let me." Ania didn't answer, but as he walked away, he saw Zora give him a small, hesitant wave. It was a tiny crack in the wall of ice he had built around his own heart. He began a careful, deliberate campaign, not of acquisition, but of courtship. He didn't try to shower them with money. Ania's pride was a fortress he knew he couldn't breach with force. Instead, he used his most valuable asset, his time. He started visiting them, not at the park, but at their small, cramped apartment, always calling first, always asking for permission. The first time he stepped inside, the contrast with his own life was a physical blow. His penthouse was a silent, minimalist expanse of glass and steel. Their home was a chaotic symphony of life. Books were stacked on every surface. Zora's half-finished electronic projects littered the coffee table. The air smelled of cinnamon and something warm cooking on the stove. It wasn't a curated space. It was a loved one. And in the center of it all was a framed photo of a smiling baby Zora on the wall. A daily reminder of the 8 years he had missed. The guilt was a constant, heavy cloak. He brought gifts for Zora, but not toys. He brought a high-end soldering iron, a box of rare earth magnets, a subscription to a journal on quantum computing. He watched, mesmerized, as her small, nimble fingers assembled complex circuits with an innate understanding that he knew some of his best engineers lacked. He wasn't just connecting with a daughter, he was witnessing a prodigy. One evening, he arrived to find Ania staring at a pale pink envelope on the kitchen table, an eviction notice. The quiet desperation in her eyes was a knife to his gut. She had been hiding the depth of her struggle from him, her pride too fierce to ask for help. That night, he made a call. He used a shell corporation to buy the entire building, then had a non-profit foundation inform all tenants that their rent was being forgiven for the next 2 years due to a new community grant. Ania was suspicious, her gaze sharp and questioning when he next visited, but she couldn't prove anything. The panic in her eyes was replaced by a weary relief, and that was enough for him. The true breakthrough came a week later. He was helping Zora debug a program she had written, a small game based on Conway's Game of Life. She was stuck on a recursive function that was causing a memory leak. He sat beside her on the floor, the two of them staring at the glowing screen, the rest of the world falling away. He didn't give her the answer. He just asked the right questions, guiding her logic until she saw the flaw herself. "Oh," she exclaimed, her face lighting up with the pure, incandescent joy of discovery. "I see it now. The base case is wrong." She quickly rewrote the code, and the program ran perfectly. She turned to him, her smile wide and unreserved, and for the first time she threw her small arms around his neck in a spontaneous hug. "Thank you," she mumbled into his shirt. Julian froze. The simple, unearned affection was overwhelming. He awkwardly patted her back, his throat tight. He looked up and saw Ania standing in the doorway, watching them. The hard shield in her eyes had softened, replaced by a complex tapestry of old pain and new, reluctant warmth. He felt a profound tectonic shift inside him. The hollow space in his chest, the one he had tried to fill with money and success, was now occupied by the small, warm weight of his daughter's trust. He was no longer just Julian Vance, CEO. He was Zora's father, and a fierce primal protectiveness washed over him. He would let nothing and no one ever hurt these two people again. Julian's newfound focus did not go unnoticed. His frequent disappearances from the office, his uncharacteristic distraction during board meetings, the sudden redirection of his personal funds, it all sent ripples through the precise, ordered world of Vance Cybernetics. And no one watched these ripples with more hawk-like intensity than Marcus Thorne. Marcus was Julian's COO, a man as sleek and cold as the chrome in the company lobby. He and Julian had risen through the ranks together, but where Julian had a spark of restless genius, Marcus possessed a chilling, methodical ambition. He had been the one to encourage Julian's ruthlessness after Ania left, to praise his decision to choose the company over childish sentiment. Yar. Marcus saw Vance Cybernetics not just as a business, but as his own future kingdom. He had hitched his wagon to Julian's star, and he would not allow it to be diverted by the ghost of a past mistake. "You're slipping, Julian," Marcus said one afternoon, entering Julian's office without knocking. He placed a tablet on the obsidian desk. On the screen were satellite photos of Julian's car parked outside Ania's rundown apartment building. "This community outreach of yours is becoming a liability. We have the Nakatomi merger in its final stages. The board needs to see strength, unwavering focus, not this." He gestured at the photos with contempt. "My personal life is not the company's concern," Julian said, his voice dangerously quiet. "When your personal life involves a woman from a past you wisely discarded and a child of questionable origin, it becomes a matter of shareholder confidence," Marcus retorted, his tone smooth and reasonable, but his eyes were like chips of flint. This woman, this Ania Washington, she applied for a low-level job, and now the CEO is spending his evenings in her tenement. The optics are disastrous. It suggests a weakness, a vulnerability. And in our world, vulnerability is blood in the water. "That's enough, Marcus," Julian warned. "Is it?" Marcus pressed on, sensing he had the upper hand. "This merger will make us the undisputed global leader. It's the culmination of everything we've worked for, everything you sacrificed. Don't let a moment of nostalgia jeopardize the empire. Cut it off. Whatever it is, end it, for the good of the company." Julian stared at Marcus, seeing him clearly for the first time. He wasn't a partner. He was a parasite, one who had fed on Julian's own worst impulses. The man's cold logic, which Julian had once admired, now seemed grotesque. "My family," Julian said, the word feeling both strange and powerful on his tongue, "is not a liability." Marcus's face tightened, almost imperceptibly. The word family was a variable he hadn't accounted for. He saw then that his warnings were having the opposite effect. Julian wasn't pulling back, he was digging in. A new, more dangerous strategy began to form in Marcus's calculating mind. If Julian wouldn't remove the distraction, then Marcus would have to create a crisis so large it would force Julian to become the cold, detached leader he needed him to be. A crisis that might, with a bit of clever framing, remove the distraction permanently. The day it happened began with a sense of promise. Julian had finally convinced Ania to visit the Vance Tower, not for an interview, but just to see it. He wanted to show Zora the big computers, the server farms that were the heart of his empire. Ania was hesitant, the building a monument to the life he had chosen over her. But Zora's excitement was infectious. For the first time, Anaya and Zora stepped into his office. Zora stared, wide-eyed, at the floor-to-ceiling panoramic view of the city. "It's like being in the sky," she whispered. Julian smiled, a genuine smile that reached his eyes. "I want to show you something," he said, leading her to a sandboxed terminal in the corner of his office. A secure, isolated system he used for testing. "You can access a simulated version of our network here. No way to do any real damage, but you can see how it works." Zora's fingers flew over the keyboard, her eyes glowing with excitement. Anaya watched, her expression a complex mix of pride and apprehension. For a fleeting moment, Julian allowed himself to imagine a future. This could be their life. His two worlds, the cold world of corporate power and the warm world of family, finally integrated. That was when the first alarm blared, a piercing high-frequency screech that signified a Level 1 security breach. Red lights began to flash along the cornices of the ceiling, bathing the pristine office in a hellish crimson glow. On the main monitor, a symbol appeared, a stylized black serpent, devouring its own tail. It was the digital signature of a notorious hacker-for-hire group known as Ouroboros. "Lockdown initiated," a calm robotic voice announced from the ceiling speakers. Heavy titanium shutters slammed down over the windows, plunging the office into the eerie red twilight of the emergency lighting. Anaya rushed to Zora's side, pulling her away from the terminal. "What's happening?" "We're under attack," Julian said, his mind already racing. He ran to his main console, his fingers flying. "Marcus, status report," he barked into his comms. "It's a worm, Julian," Marcus's voice came back, strained with convincing panic. "It's bypassing everything, our firewalls, our countermeasures. It's like they had the source code. It's moving through the network, encrypting everything. The merger data, our proprietary algorithms, it's all being targeted." Julian's top engineers were reporting in, their voices edged with disbelief and fear. They were locked out. The worm was not only encrypting files, it was actively rewriting security protocols to block their access. It was an elegant, brutal piece of code, and it was gutting his company from the inside out. Vance Cybernetics, the unsinkable ship of digital security, was sinking. In the chaos, Marcus's voice cut through again, dripping with insinuation. "Julian, the initial breach vector seems to have originated from a low-level access point, an external application submitted through the HR portal around the time that Washington woman was here." The accusation hung in the air, sickening and potent. Julian felt a surge of rage. Marcus was trying to frame her. The attack wasn't just on the company, it was on his family. His old life was making a violent final play to destroy his new one. The stakes were no longer about a merger or money, they were about everything. The storm that had been threatening all day finally broke, rain lashing against the titanium shutters, the sound of thunder mixing with the insistent shriek of the alarms. Julian felt a cold wave of despair. His team was blind, his company was bleeding out, and the man he suspected was behind it all was playing the role of his loyal second-in-command. The company, his life's work, was moments away from catastrophic failure. It was Zora's small voice that cut through the noise. She had crept back to the sandboxed terminal, her face illuminated by the screen. "It's going backwards," she said, her voice quiet but clear. Julian barely heard her, trying to bypass a lockout on the main server. "Zora, get away from there now. It's not safe." "No, listen," she insisted, her tone gaining an urgent authority that made him pause. "The encryption, it's not just writing junk data, it's copying the file, encrypting the copy, then deleting the original. But the deletion command it's using, it's lazy. It just removes the file from the directory table. It doesn't overwrite the data on the disk." Julian stared at her, the import of her words slowly dawning on him. Standard procedure for military-grade deletion was a multi-pass overwrite. This was sloppy. "And look," she said, pointing to the scrolling code of the worm, which she had somehow isolated in the simulation. The recursive loop that spreads the worm. "It's calling itself, but it's not clearing its own memory stack properly. With every hop it makes to a new system, it gets bigger and slower. It's inefficient." An 8-year-old girl was critiquing the code of a world-class cyber attack. And she was right. The attackers had focused on a brilliant, unstoppable entry, but the code itself had flaws, subtle ones, the kind that panicked engineers hunting for a kill switch would overlook. But Zora, in the calm bubble of her isolated terminal, saw it with perfect clarity. A plan, insane but brilliant, formed in Julian's mind. "Elias," he said into his personal comms, "give Terminal 52 Alpha full administrative access to the core network. Now." "Sir, that's your sandboxed office terminal," Elias replied, confused. "It's not secure." "Do it," Julian commanded. He knelt beside Zora. The fate of his entire company, his legacy, was balanced on a knife's edge. "Zora," he said, his voice steady, "you see that flaw in the recursion? Can you write a script that exploits it? Something that makes the worm attack itself?" Zora looked from the screen to his face, her eyes wide. She wasn't scared. She was focused. She nodded. "I think so. If I can make it think its own code is a new system to infect, it will get stuck in a loop and keep allocating memory until it crashes itself." "Ania," Julian said, turning to her, "I need you to trust me." "I need you to trust her." Ania looked at her daughter, then at the desperate hope in Julian's eyes. She nodded slowly, her hand resting on Zora's shoulder. "Okay." It was the most surreal scene Julian could have ever imagined. While his elite team of engineers fought and failed, he stood behind his 8-year-old daughter, watching her small fingers dance across the keyboard. She wasn't playing a game anymore. She was a warrior, her battlefield the glowing lines of code on the screen. She wrote with an intuitive grace that was breathtaking, a short, elegant counterscript that was more like a poem than a program. "Ready," she whispered. "Execute," Julian said. She hit enter. For a moment nothing happened. The red light still flashed. The alarms still blared. Then, on the main monitor, the serpent icon flickered. The encryption processes across the network began to halt, one by one, as the worm turned on itself, gorging on its own code until it bloated, sputtered, and died. And in its death throes, the counterscript Zora had written did one last thing. It followed the worm's path backward, a trail of digital breadcrumbs, all the way to its origin point. A single location flashed on the screen, blinking in bright, damning green. Source: Executive Terminal 52 Bravo. User: M. Thorne, Marcus's terminal, in the office right next door. The breath left Julian's body in a rush. It was all there. The motive, the means, the proof. The betrayal was absolute, colder and deeper than he could have imagined. At that moment his comms crackled. It was the lead negotiator for the Nakatomi merger. "Vance, what the hell is going on? My board is pulling the plug. You have 5 minutes to salvage this deal, or it's dead forever." The choice was laid bare before him, stark and unambiguous. His old life versus his new one. He could bury the evidence against Marcus, save the merger, and preserve the empire. It would be the logical move, the one the old Julian would have made without hesitation. Or he could choose the truth. He could choose them. He looked at Zora, her face flushed with triumph, and at Anaya, her eyes shining with tears of relief and pride. There was no choice at all. "Elias," Julian said, his voice ringing with a newfound authority, "lock down Marcus Thorne's office. He is not to leave the floor, and patch me through to the Nakatomi board." He stood tall, Zora and Ania at his side. He faced the main monitor. "Gentlemen," he began, his voice calm and clear, You can cancel your deal. Vance Cybernetics has just weathered a direct internal assault orchestrated by its own COO. Our proprietary code is secure. Our systems are being restored as we speak by our newest and brightest security analyst. He placed a hand on Zora's shoulder. We are stronger than ever. The merger, however, is off. My company does not reward treachery. We will be pursuing criminal charges. He cut the connection, the silence that followed filled only by the sound of the rain outside. He had just voluntarily detonated his life's biggest business deal, and he had never felt so free. The aftermath was swift and decisive. Marcus Thorne, faced with irrefutable proof, confessed everything. He admitted to orchestrating the cyber attack to scare Julian back in line and frame Anaya. But the deeper confession was the one that truly shattered Julian. Marcus admitted to intercepting an email years ago, a desperate, heartfelt message from Anaya revealing she was pregnant and wanted to make things work. He had deleted it and sent one back from a spoofed account in Julian's name, a cold, brutal message telling her he had made his choice, and it was his career. The foundation of Julian's decade of regret was a lie, crafted by the man he had called his partner. The chasm of lost years was not a mutual failing, it was a sabotage. 6 months later, the Vance Tower looked the same from the outside, but everything inside had changed. Julian stood not on the cold marble of the lobby, but on the warm wood of a wide porch, watching the sunset paint the sky in hues of orange and purple. The house wasn't a sterile monument to wealth, it was a home filled with the comfortable clutter of family life. Zora's latest drone prototype buzzed peacefully over a flower garden Anaya had planted. The Nakatomi merger had been renegotiated. After the news of the foiled corporate sabotage broke, their board had come back to the table impressed by Julian's integrity. He had secured a deal even more favorable than the original. Anaya, who had initially refused any high-level position, had eventually been convinced to lead a new independent ethics division at the company, ensuring Vance Cybernetics' power was always wielded responsibly. She was a check and balance, not just for the company, but for him. Julian was no longer just a CEO. He left the office at 5 every day. He helped Zora with her homework, which now consisted of advanced robotics and AI theory. He had dinner with his family. He learned about Ania's day, not just as a department head, but as the woman he had never stopped loving. The silence in his life was no longer an expensive, empty void. It was a peaceful quiet, filled with the comforting presence of the two people who had breached his defenses and captured his heart. Later that evening, he tucked Zora into bed. She had a framed picture on her nightstand, not of a celebrity or a cartoon character, but of the three of them, taken on this very porch, all of them smiling. "You know," Zora said sleepily, "stopping that worm was easy. The code was emotional." Julian frowned. "Emotional? What do you mean?" "It was angry," she said, her eyes fluttering shut. "Angry things don't think clearly. They always make mistakes." He kissed her forehead, his heart swelling with a love so profound it felt like a physical presence in the room. He walked back out to the porch and stood beside Anaya, slipping his arm around her. They watched the first stars appear in the twilight sky. He had spent a decade building an empire of ones and zeros, only to discover that true value couldn't be quantified. It was in the warmth of a hand in his, the sound of his daughter's laughter, and the quiet peace of a shared sky. He was finally home.